Welcome to an introduction to Vermont EMS in the Warm Zone.
This is Lieutenant Hugh O'Donnell with the Vermont State Police Tactical Services Unit. Our unit has been teaching active threat response to law enforcement officers throughout the state for over 15 years. In recent years, a need has been identified for further integration between EMS and law enforcement during these events to provide victims with life-saving care. I want to thank everyone that has been involved in bringing this to all EMS agencies in the state to better serve our citizens in times of need.
I'm Dan Batesy, EMS Chief for the Vermont Department of Health, and I'm here today to welcome you to the EMS in the Warm Zone Active Shooter Best Practice Guide. The EMS office recognizes that many departments are working with local law enforcement resources to develop response plans to large-scale events such as an active shooter. These guidelines have been developed to assist those departments and reflect national best practices. It's important to remember that not all departments will develop warm zone plans, but this information is still important as in a large-scale event, many departments will have to work together. Although we have a great deal of important information for you in this program, no plan can truly be developed without working with your local law enforcement department. That ongoing collaboration is key to developing any safe plan. I hope you enjoy this program, and as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact our office.
The broad objectives are close-to-home intro, terminology, description of EMS in the Warm Zone, changes in response type, description of hazard zones, response to scenes, rescue task force for EMS, on-scene assembly, treatment priorities, casualty collection points, state guide to Vermont EMS Warm Zone response, closing remarks, glossary and reference at the very end of the presentation. We'll be discussing the following objectives in much greater detail as we reach each section within this presentation. Throughout this presentation, the terms victim, patient, and casualty are used interchangeably. It is important that we as emergency responders recognize that violent attacks are happening all around us. This is not just something we hear about on the news anymore. These attacks are taking place in urban, suburban, and rural settings. In 2006, the Essex Elementary School shooting took Vermont through horrific turmoil. 2 people were shot dead, 3 people were injured, and the scene spread through 4 different locations. This was one of the most uncertain times in my career. This was my first look into an area of response that I had not received any prior training on. We did the best that we could, but like any unexpected situation, we learned areas that need improvement.
It just brings back the memory, having been there, having gone into the school.
August 24th, 2006, police say Christopher Williams walked into Essex Elementary School and opened fire, killing teacher Alicia Shanks after killing his ex-girlfriend's mother, Linda Lambesi, at home. Current Richmond Police Chief Alan Buck was a state trooper at the time, helping command the response.
I think police officers from every department in this county showed up.
Police would arrest Williams, who had shot himself, though not fatally. He was convicted and is currently in prison. The day of the shooting could have been much worse if school had been in session, but it wasn't. Only teachers and staff were there. Even so, Buck says an event like this can be hard for anyone to deal with.
The worst thing is, and I can tell you that from experience, is to bottle it up and not talk to anybody. That's where you start to get the stomach problems and the migraine headaches.
Buck hopes the community never has to go through another school shooting, but he says with rising tensions in society and more drugs coming into Vermont, it may only be a matter of time.
It has happened here. It's going to probably happen again here. And we just have to be vigilant. School boards have to take this into account. And I think they're still in this state. I think there are still people who think that's never going to happen here.
There is a lot of terminology within this presentation, some of which you may be unfamiliar with. Each term will be discussed where they are pertinent within the presentation. I've provided a list of definitions to each of these in the glossary at the end of the presentation. Let's start by identifying what is EMS response into the warm zone. Warm zone operation is a pre-planned process which involves collaborative effort between law enforcement and EMS. The goal of the process is to get emergency care to victims much faster than we ever have. We do this by approaching an area that has been deemed mostly safe while working under law enforcement protection. Warm zone operation will be utilized when there is some risk of a violent threat to EMS.
Hi, this is Dr. Wolfson. Unfortunately, active shooter and mass casualty incidents are becoming more common in our society, and can happen in any community, large or small. The historical practice of EMS staging until the scene is safe may no longer be operational best practice. Clearing a scene can take hours, yet certain types of injuries require emergent medical care within minutes in order to save lives. Research has shown that such point-of-wound care is essential for treating victims of massive hemorrhage, airway compromise, and tension pneumothorax. Death from large artery bleeding may occur in 2 to 4 minutes. Death from airway compromise may occur in 4 to 6 minutes. Death from tension pneumothorax may occur in 15 to 20 minutes. By entering the warm zone, EMS providers may apply a tourniquet or hemostatic bandage to control severe hemorrhage, place the victim in the recovery position to prevent positional airway obstruction, and if a paramedic, perform needle decompression to treat a tension pneumothorax. These time-critical interventions can save lives. The information we are sharing with you today will help those of you who choose to coordinate with your local law enforcement agency to perform these interventions as safely as possible. Thank you for your service and be safe.
FBI data suggests that incidents involving active violent attacks usually end before law enforcement arrive on scene, and usually ends with the assailant killing themselves. This is not always the case, but has shown to be more often than not. The action of injury happens quickly. The part that takes the longest is clearing every corner within the area to deem it safe for EMS to enter. As Dr. Wolfson already mentioned, the process of clearing an area for EMS takes detail and time. The time is what patients with critical wounds don't have in their favor. Clearing a scene can take hours, and a patient who's exsanguinating may only have minutes. Most wounds victims sustain are not immediately fatal, such as wounds to extremities, but casualties die while waiting for EMS to get to them. The scenes of mass killings have been assessed, and it has been determined that something as simple as proper tourniquet placement immediately following a wound will increase survival. The past of staging until law enforcement deems the scene clear is becoming less acceptable by public standards. The term clear means that there is no foreseeable threat or that the scene is considered cold. This can take hours. We are not replacing the meaning of the word safe because our operations, even in the warm zone, should be safe. We need to look at the changes moving into the future differently than we have been. As our world changes around us, it is our duty to adapt our procedures to remain ahead of the curve. In every industry, there are changes based on needs. The industry of EMS is learning quickly that there is a need to have EMS assessing patients quicker in these types of situations. EMS has faced many progressive changes as our role has evolved. The identification of infectious disease transmission was a newfound concept in history of medicine years ago. The use of body substance isolation was a huge transition providers were forced to make. Nowadays, it's a foreign concept to think about not wearing gloves when treating our patients. I expect years down the road, warm zone response will be as second nature as body substance isolation is to our providers now. It has to start somewhere. We are now making safety everyone's responsibility, making responders aware of potential threats and giving them the training, tools, and gear to best protect themselves. Warm zone response by EMS is a level of response that is sweeping across the United States. Although warm zone response is optional for agencies to participate in, all responders need to be aware of the procedures surrounding this type of response. No longer will EMS be expected to hang back and wait until the scene is deemed neutral or safe. So why is EMS changing their response? The number one reason to change the response model is to increase the number of survivors. Our job is to take care of people. People call us when they need us. Statistics show that people are dying while awaiting care, period. The number one goal is to keep EMS safe while providing life-saving care to as many casualties as possible within the shortest amount of time. There is a national push to instill change amongst responding agencies, which is being endorsed by some well-known reputable organizations. We have now developed some state guidance to help facilitate the changes for those agencies interested in moving towards this level of response. This presentation is meant to assist EMS in the best practices and general concepts of EMS working with their law enforcement agency to safely and effectively provide immediate care to victims of violent attacks. The State of Vermont EMS Office is not mandating any service be responsible for providing this level of response. They are simply providing guidance for those that are interested. If services choose to take on this level of response, they are to follow the guidance provided in the EMS in the Warm Zone Active Shooter Best Practice Guide. Whether or not your agency adopts this level of response, all responders need to understand the overall concepts of this operation. So as we begin, some hazard zones to be aware of are cold zone, warm zone, hot zone. You can see those zones broken up on the screen by the different colors. Cold zone is in yellow, warm zone is in green, hot zone is in red. Cold zone specifically for EMS staging, command post, patient triage. This could be a large area, this could be a smaller area. The green is your warm zone. That is where EMS and law enforcement officers are working together to provide care to patients within this area. The green zone is an area of potential threat. Hopefully the threat is more contained, but there is a potential for things to change. The hot zone specifically, which is the red circle on the slide here, is more specifically for law enforcement, and this is an area for EMS to be aware of. There should be no situation where EMS is procedurally planned or put within this zone. Similar to our hazard zones in hazmat situations, we have a cold zone, warm zone, hot zone. Cold zone is listed in yellow. That's for EMS staging, command post, patient triage. Warm zone, this is a new area for EMS that we are discussing moving into with law enforcement officers to care for casualty victims. The hot zone is strictly for law enforcement and the contact team. Now that we've had an initial orientation to warm zone response, what it entails, who's going to be doing it, and kind of the description of the whole thing, we're now going to move into an area that's a little bit more specific, and that's response to scene. When to use this response, using something called the threat acronym, key information for responders, mental preparation for scene, and the teams. When dispatched to any location rich in soft targets, for example, schools, daycares, or a crowded recreational area, and you have information that there may be an aggressive or deadly attack, responders should seriously consider a warm zone level response. At the point EMS arrives on scene and the threat is found to be active or ongoing, all responders should refer to the threat acronym. This acronym is to assist responders in prioritizing key elements of a situation of high threat. It is important to note that threat suppression is not the role of EMS. Remember, this acronym is for all responders. Once you've received this dispatch, responders should discontinue any unnecessary radio traffic and remain listening for further detailed information. This is a situation where agencies should consider using secondary radio channels for ordinary radio traffic, which is not immediately related to the responding crew. Limiting unnecessary radio communication will limit the opportunity for confusion. Responders should be ready to write the information down to maintain record of what is known. Important information includes location and the number of patients, any specific scene safety issues to be aware of, or other directions, type of weapons involved, type of location or soft targets, safe approaching route, command post location, staging areas. Other considerations should be contacting your local emergency department to let them know of the incident you have going on, as well as getting mutual aid en route and staging them depending on your scene and the situation. There have been situations where more than one mechanism of threat has either been planned out or utilized. For example, Columbine, guns and explosives were used and planned for. Even though the attack may have already occurred, that doesn't mean that secondary devices aren't planned to go off after the fact. The risk that a warm zone has potential to turn hot should never be overlooked. Our goal is to maintain safety, but there are still some unknowns which teams need to remain flexible for. Agencies should take training seriously and run providers through scenarios where the scene hazards change. During approach to a scene, crews should be prepared for anything. In a warm zone operation, there are two main teams to be aware of: contact team and a rescue task force team.
Going right.
The contact team consists of law enforcement officers only, and they are the only team that operates within the hot zone. A contact team is the first arriving law enforcement officers whose job is to immediately enter the building and move towards the threat. The contact team's priority is limit suspects' movement, stop the deadly behavior, and continue past victims and fallen officers. This is not a place for EMS. EMS's job at this point is to be awaiting command's instruction to meet up with the next available law enforcement officers to create a rescue task force team. A rescue task force team is made up of law enforcement officers and emergency medical responders. Their priorities are casualty treatment, casualty removal, and movement of supplies from the cold to the warm zone. The next section of this presentation is going to be focused more specifically on the rescue task force. The rescue task force can be made up of 2 and 2 or 4 and 2 ratio of law enforcement to EMS providers, task force team guidelines, movement as a rescue task force, rule of weapons, and accountability. In general, the recommendation that Vermont is adopting is that the rescue task force model incorporates the response of EMS and law enforcement as a team into the warm zone to care for victims. Do not self-deploy EMS into the warm zone alone. This will be completed next once command is set up and personnel have arrived and established a need for it. So who makes the decision about the task force? Unified command. The decision is based on the need for a team, meaning there are casualties, unknown time frame for a safe zone, law enforcement capabilities to support a team, and whether EMS has the training, proper gear, and equipment. One rescue task force team consists of the following: a minimum of 2 law enforcement officers and 2 licensed EMS personnel. The preferred team makeup is 4 law enforcement officers and 2 licensed EMS personnel. However, it is also acceptable to use 2 law enforcement officers and 2 EMS personnel. The physical formation of the team members within the rescue task force depends on the number of law enforcement officers present. The photo on the left is an example of 2 law enforcement officers and 2 EMS personnel. The photo on the right is an example of 4 law enforcement officers and 2 EMS personnel. The 4th officer is not easily seen because he is behind the rescue members. No matter the formation, there are a few guidelines to take note of when operating as a rescue task force team member. EMS always remains inside law enforcement cover. EMS follows the direction and guidance of law enforcement officers within their team. EMS performs care within the boundaries created by the law enforcement officers. EMS should not expect assistance in patient care or removal from the law enforcement officers within their team. The cross-utilization of skills can create confusion in prioritization of one's responsibilities. Law enforcement is there for our protection. EMS is there to provide patient care and extrication to safety. It is crucial that EMS learn to move together when in team formation during warm zone operation. We in EMS are not used to moving as a system that's so carefully and cautiously orchestrated. As a standard, EMS will allow law enforcement officers to set the direction of movement. EMS has to revert back to what's safe and allow law enforcement officers who have specialized training to dictate the movement. In some of the photos, you will notice the placement of the rescuer's hands on the back of the officers or other team members that are in front of them. This actually allows for brisk group movement with nonverbal feedback. It allows members to stay together based on pace and distance, gauge each other's movement without having to watch too carefully, allows the person in front of you to know where you are without needing to look back or to talk. It is also important that you don't hold the person back and that you can easily release yourself if the threat changes. We don't want this to hinder our movement. EMS should not be holding the person in front of them as much as light touch to allow fluid movement as a team. In this short clip, you will observe a rescue task force team moving together as a unit. As the team moves forward, you will notice that EMS is mostly concealed behind the officers. You will also notice that the officers' attentions will shift based on their approach to an intersection or doorway. But EMS should stay quiet, close, and focused on commands being given to them. Unless pertinent information needs to be shared, there should be no discussion between members. Here's an example of a team moving as a unit through a doorway. A team in a stairway moving from lower to higher. Here, the team is moving from a higher level to a lower level. This is a great example of entering an area that is believed to be mostly safe to care for a casualty while under law enforcement's protection. Coming into an office area which opens up to other hallways, doorways, closets, and cubicles can add added risk for EMS responders because perpetrators have an area to hide. Observe the video and watch how the officers move in while maintaining a protective triangle around the EMS providers. It is also important that when approaching victims, EMS providers be cognizant of their surroundings because the victim you are treating has potential to be the offender. During warm zone operation, there needs to be clear boundaries, and medical personnel must be clear about what their role is. We are not the police, and we want it to be clear in these situations who has the weapons. If we approach warm zone operation correctly, EMS doesn't need weapons. There will be no situation where EMS will be left without a law enforcement officer. One officer will remain with personnel within the warm zone at all times. EMS should not become involved in mitigation of acute threats, like returning fire, taking down a suspect, or any other immediate altercation. Medical personnel will not be responsible for weapons, IEDs, or security. In these types of situations, scene security and accountability are of top priority. With scene security also comes the accountability. One of the first actions in a situation like this is to gain control of the immediate area, which means no one in and no one out without proper ID. Emergency personnel should not expect access to this type of scene without proper identification, which includes clear credentialing to be allowed in. All EMS members need to have an ID from their agency that clearly relays who they are, the agency they are there with, and their certification level at a minimum. Agencies should consider issuing 2 ID tags to each person. One ID tag which will remain with the person that allows access in and out of the scene. The second ID tag will be assigned to the incident command post to account for the whereabouts of the individual throughout the working scene. Command will maintain accountability of rescue task force teams, locations, and jobs being performed. One of the first actions in a situation like this is to gain control and to maintain control. Accountability is a priority. In this next section of the PowerPoint, we will begin to discuss the actual rescue task force responsibilities. The assembly on scene, stabilizing the patient, moving on, preparing for entry, personal protective equipment, important terminology the rescue task force members need to know, and what to do if your warm zone turns hot. Job responsibilities of a rescue task force team include stabilizing victims, positioning victims, and moving on to more victims. Team 1 should be focused on life-saving techniques and moving forward to contact as many victims as possible within the warm zone. They should only extricate victims if they feel the victims have survivable injuries and may be at risk for further complication in the moment. For example, attentioning pneumothorax where a paramedic isn't easily available, or a trunk wound where bleeding can't be controlled by placement of a tourniquet. EMS personnel will be faced with some difficult decisions and some that may be based solely on the level of care they are able to provide and whether or not the situation has been stabilized. Those not viewed as critical shall be cared for and instructed to shelter in place until it is safe to be moved. Each casualty's location will be communicated to the command post, and subsequent rescue task force teams will be responsible for extrication of them with their known location. The second team may be given a similar job as the first team, or depending on the size of the incident, they may begin the removal process of casualties. It is important to reiterate that the 2 EMS team members of a rescue task force team are responsible for the removal of the patient on their own. The number of rescue task force teams is based on the complexity of the incident, access to the patients, number of access points to the patients, number of casualties, and severity of casualties. More on treatment will follow. The number of rescue task force teams shall be decided by incident command or unified command. In any situation where there is a warm zone operation taking place, police and EMS should be in close contact. Rescue task force teams should be briefed with the most up-to-date information prior to entering the warm zone. It is also crucial for teams to have clear understanding of their assigned tasks to eliminate wasted time due to confusion. EMS personnel should not lose sight of themselves becoming a potential casualty, which may or may not be the result of an initial attack. Secondary devices should be a consideration, as well as exertional injuries related to the duties being performed. The vest is to protect against any unforeseen threat that teams will not knowingly be exposed to. Do not allow the vest to give you a faulty sense of security. Some of the new required gear is a ballistic vest with clear rescue task force EMS identifiers, a ballistic helmet, eye protection, and flashlight. Each agency should prepare go bags for their rescue task force members, which should include mostly life-saving trauma equipment and basic airway adjuncts. This is not your run kit and does not include oxygen. It's difficult to plan for a sizable incident, and no matter how prepared we are, the incident will most likely strap Vermont's EMS system. Each member of the rescue task force team should carry their own self-aid equipment on their person. This is treatment for yourself should you become a patient and should not be used on anyone else. Some of the items within the bag should include, but are not limited to, the following: tourniquets for both adult and pediatric, pressure dressings, hemostatic bandages, occlusive dressings, airway adjuncts, decompression needles for paramedics, and removal devices, a sked, tarp, or straps. EMS agencies are strongly encouraged to reach out and begin discussion with their local law enforcement agencies before initiating this type of response. Agencies should also take initiative and open up discussion within their membership about warm zone operation. An individual's decision to participate in warm zone response with their agency should completely be voluntary. Not everyone is fit to work under these conditions physically or emotionally, and agencies should be cognizant of who those individuals are. There are many jobs to be done on and around a scene and will still require EMS personnel. It is also useful for EMS agencies to include other agencies like first response and fire departments to encourage a safer, more organized response. It is fully up to the agency as to whether or not they desire being involved in this type of response. In addition to the introductory presentation, the state EMS office will require further, more detailed training for the members participating in a rescue task force. Some of that includes the TCCC, the TECC, or equivalent training. Services will be required to provide protective gear to members of a rescue task force team that's listed in the best practice guide. have required treatment bags with material list, regular training and coordination with their local law enforcement agency. Agencies have the responsibility to make sure that their personnel can physically and emotionally perform the duties being assigned to them. Agencies may want to consider a physical fitness standard. No one should be pressured into working within the warm zone. Rigorous training will be required to keep members conditioned for the level of response and exertion. Agencies may want to consider putting together a team of individuals to provide this level of care. Everyone has a limit, and it is important that personnel know theirs. We are a very small state, and in situations involving a school or a public building, responders who have family members as casualties may not be in the right state of mind to send in. Some terminology all members need to know are the following: concealment, cover, and shelter in place. Concealment means simply to find an object that provides a visual barrier to prevent being seen. The object here is to not be detected. In the event a warm zone becomes hot or an unexpected threat arises, law enforcement officers may quickly direct team members to shelter in place. When sheltering in place, you find a location where you and the casualty, if you have one with you, will be protected, preferably behind a door until the team arrives to move you. A classroom, an office, a janitorial closet are all examples of a great area to shelter in place. At least one law enforcement officer will always remain with EMS. In a sheltering in place scenario, law enforcement officers would stand protecting the only access point to the room to provide the most adequate protection. If being told to take cover, team members are expected to immediately find an object to get behind that will stop the projectile of a firearm. Examples are a cement wall, a metal wall, or brick wall. We want to believe that all situations we enter are going to be as safe as they possibly can, but we also must remember that we are in a somewhat unstable situation that can change at any moment. EMS personnel need to know what to do if the hazard changes. This means training in similar environments. These situations are tough because our natural instinct is going to be to protect ourselves. This is why training is vitally important with warm zone operation. Rescue Task Force team members need to work on conditioning themselves to work together under pressure and constant focus of their team. Members of a Rescue Task Force team have to remain flexible. Should the threat level change, law enforcement officers will take immediate steps to mitigate the threat, which may include returning fire. Should this situation arise, EMS should immediately follow law enforcement's direction, evacuate if it's safe to do so, or shelter in place. The next section of this presentation will focus on treatment priorities. The MARCH acronym: hemorrhage control, airway management, breathing, treatment limitations within a warm zone, and casualty collection points. You may have heard throughout this presentation the term point of wound care. It simply means treatment that's taking place in or around the location where the injury initially occurred. The MARCH acronym can be used to help prioritize treatment: massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia, and head injury. Life-saving skills only should be taking place in warm zones. Stopping the bleeding is our number one priority. The bleeding we have the most trouble stopping are wounds at the junction of the torso. This would be an example of someone to immediately extricate. Our first responsibility is to stop life-threatening external hemorrhage. Direct a casualty to apply a tourniquet if available. Apply a tourniquet over the clothing 2 to 3 inches proximal to the wound. Tighten until cessation of bleeding. For response personnel, tourniquets should be readily available and accessible with either hand. Consider instructing casualties to apply direct pressure to the wound if no tourniquet is available or application is not tactically feasible. Consider application of a second tourniquet just proximal to the first one for failure to control bleeding. Apply a topical hemostatic bandage if combination with direct pressure or pressure bandage using Curlex or Ace Wrap for wounds in anatopical areas where tourniquet application is ineffective. When using impregnated gauze, the provider must pack the wound and provide a minimum of 5 minutes of pressure to activate a clotting action. It may take more than one package of gauze before bleeding begins to stop. It is important that all responders know their equipment. Airway management in an unconscious casualty without an airway obstruction. First, chin lift or jaw thrust maneuver. Second, nasal pharyngeal airway. Third, place the casualty in the recovery position. For a casualty with an airway obstruction or impending airway obstruction, a chin lift or jaw thrust maneuver, nasopharyngeal airway, and allow a conscious casualty to assume any position that best protects the airway, to include sitting up. When addressing breathing in a casualty with progressive respiratory distress and known or suspected torso trauma, consider a tension pneumothorax and refer to a medic as soon as possible for needle decompression. All open chest and back wounds should be treated by immediately applying a vented chest seal to cover the defect. Any open wounds from the level of the umbilicus to the shoulder should be treated with an occlusive dressing. It is not standard practice to provide ALS treatment at point of wound locations. However, depending on the situation and if sheltering in place for a long period of time, it may be practical to provide a higher level of care. In general, teams will not be carrying fluids, O2, advanced airway devices, or intravenous access equipment, but there may be situations where equipment could be passed into a room, such as through a small window. In the last section of this presentation, we're going to discuss casualty collection point, an area designated for the collection of patients, which is just outside the warm zone. The number of casualties and scene size may require multiple casualty collection points. The casualty collection point is an area designated specifically for casualties being removed from the warm zone. This may be one of multiple designated areas where patients moved out of the warm zone and into a cold area. In Vermont, our weather is often unpredictable and cold. Therefore, a casualty collection point may actually remain inside a secure part of the building. Providers in the cold area will move victims to appropriate treatment areas based on acuity. Depending on the size of the scene, it may be desirable to have more than one casualty collection point. It should be clear to teams responsible for removal to know which collection point is closest to them. Your treatment area and salt triage area should be in the cold zone, meaning a safe and secure location. We have not discussed the salt triage plan at all throughout this presentation. The reason for that is because this level of response is about time and safety. During a standard MCI event, let's say a bus rollover, the threat to EMS is somewhat known. We anticipate the hazards that accompany a crash. However, in an active threat scenario, there is no real way to anticipate the threats. Therefore, during warm zone operation, the key is to locate victims, quickly treat them, secure them, and prevent further injury. Once they are moved to a treatment and triage area, tags may be placed and full triage taken place. If a scene is declared no longer a threat to emergency services and law enforcement feels we are now safe to move around the scene, salt triage may take over as it typically would have been started if there was no threat. Casualties will arrive to the treatment area from a casualty collection point. All standard salt triage practices should take place from this point forward as long as no threat exists. EMS should expect walking wounded and self-extrication of uninjured individuals from the area of threat. At this point, EMS can begin to corral those walking wounded and start salt triage as long as you are within a cold area. EMS should not direct victims to move themselves throughout the warm zone unless they have been directed to do so by law enforcement. Any casualties that are ambulatory should be advised to shelter in place or be shown where to exit through the safest, closest egress point. In the very near future, there will be an introduction of Vermont EMS in the Warm Zone Active Shooter Best Practice Guide. This guide provides more in-depth information for agencies considering this level of response. Agencies are strongly encouraged to follow the guidance within this document. The document includes other information not mentioned in this presentation. As we close, agencies considering this response need to do their homework. It takes time to complete training, engage your supporting law enforcement agencies, and obtain equipment and gear. Warm zone operation preparedness is not a quick process and will require significant continuing education and training to maintain safe function. This is a collaborative effort. Agencies cannot do it on their own. We need to take action to be prepared. That is what our communities already expect from us. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay safe.